The rain was relentless, each drop a tiny hammer against the pavement, turning the streets into glistening rivers. Mai's soaked shoes splashed through the puddles, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she clutched the flimsy plastic bag containing the last of her groceries. The bag was torn at the edge, and she cursed silently as a tomato slipped out, rolling away like a small red heart. She couldn't stop to pick it up. Bao needed her. As she walked down the narrow street, the wind whipped her hair around her face, and for a moment she felt like a shadow in this city, a nameless figure lost in the crowd. She was young, only 28, but years of hardship had aged her far beyond her years. The tiredness in her bones wasn't just from the physical exertion, it was from the constant, grinding pressure of living a life on the edge, always teetering between hope and despair. Mai's apartment, just a few blocks away, was a small, crumbling space in a building that seemed to lean in on itself. The paint peeled from the walls, and the light in the hallway flickered like a dying firefly. But it was hers, and in this world, that meant everything. She remembered when she first moved in, how proud she'd felt, even though the apartment had barely enough space for a bed, let alone a proper kitchen. But she'd made it work. For Bao. Bao, her son, the light of her life, the reason she kept going. He was only 7, yet he understood more about sacrifice and survival than most adults. They had no family to lean on, no safety net. It was just her and him against the world, and most days she was winning. But today she wasn't sure. She reached the small apartment building, the windows dim and unwelcoming, but there, in the corner of her mind, was the small flicker of hope that kept her going. Bao would be waiting for her, with that crooked smile of his, the one that always made her feel like everything would be okay, even when she knew it wouldn't. The door creaked open, and she was met with silence. It wasn't the comforting kind of quiet, like when you're alone with your thoughts, but the kind of silence that made her heart drop into her stomach. She walked inside, slipping off her drenched shoes, and scanned the room. Bao's school bag was thrown haphazardly on the couch, and his shoes were neatly placed by the door. "Bao!" she called softly, a pang of fear clawing at her chest. There was no answer. Her heart raced, and she rushed down the narrow hallway, pushing open the door to his room. There, tucked under the covers, was her son. His small form was still, and for a brief, terrifying second, I thought he might be asleep forever. But then he stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and a weak smile spread across his face. "Mom," Bao whispered, his voice barely above a murmur. "I'm hungry." Mai's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to reach out, gather him in her arms and tell him everything would be okay. But she couldn't. She could barely keep the light on in their apartment, let alone keep his belly full. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. She forced a smile, brushing his hair from his forehead. "I'm going to make you something to eat. Just rest, okay?" Bao nodded, but his eyes were clouded with the same worry that weighed on her every day. He wasn't a child who complained often, but this hunger had become a constant shadow in their lives. As Mai moved into the kitchen, the silence in the apartment became suffocating. She opened the fridge, the small light flickering as if it, too, was struggling to stay alive. There was nothing, just a few wilted vegetables and some rice. She could make something, but it wouldn't be enough. It never was. Her thoughts raced, but there was no solution. No miracle was coming. The money she earned from her part-time job as a cashier barely covered rent, let alone groceries. The other job, cleaning houses, paid even less. But what else could she do? There was no choice, no way out. She stood frozen, staring at the empty fridge, the weight of her failure pressing down on her chest like a ton of brick. Bao had trusted her. He believed in her. And she couldn't even give him a meal. How could she look him in the eye when she was failing him so completely? Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. The message was from the school, an automatic notification. It made her stomach turn as she read the words. Bao was sent home early today due to fainting in class. Please come to pick him up immediately. Her heart dropped. She didn't need to read further to know what had happened. Bao hadn't fainted because of some illness. He hadn't eaten all day. He hadn't eaten in days. Mai's vision blurred as the edges of the world around her seemed to fade. How had it come to this? How had she allowed it to get this bad? Every day felt like an impossible balancing act, and now the ground was slipping out from under her. She grabbed her coat, still wet from the rain, and rushed out the door. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel of her old car, the engine sputtering as she pulled away. She tried to push back the rising tide of panic, telling herself she had to be strong for Bao. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. She was running out of time, and she had no idea where to turn. By the time she reached the school, her hands were clenched tight against the wheel, and her breath was ragged. She had never been late to pick Bao up before. Never. The headmaster, a stern man with sharp eyes, was standing by the entrance. When he saw her, he straightened, his gaze sharp and critical. "Mai," he said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. "Bao fainted during class. He needs rest." I know," she stammered, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." The principal didn't respond, only gave her a long, measured look. Mai could feel his eyes on her, as if he was judging her every move, every word. In his world, there was no room for excuses. But in her world, there was no room for anything but survival. She hurried to Bao's side, her heart aching as she knelt beside him. His small, fragile body was curled on a bench, his eyes closed as if he were in a deep, exhausted sleep. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, brushing his cheek gently. "I promise things will get better. I'll make it better for you." And for the first time in a long while, as she looked at her son, she wasn't sure if that was a promise she could keep. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step a painful reminder of how close she was to losing control. Mai's fingers tightened around the handle of the plastic bag as she walked down the familiar path, the same path she'd taken every day for the past year. Bao was quiet beside her, his small hand slipping into hers, as if he, too, could feel the weight of the world pressing down on them. She wanted to tell him everything would be fine. She always did, but today, her own words felt like a lie. The apartment was cold when they arrived. Mai kicked off her shoes, trying to shake off the sense of dread that had followed her through the entire walk. Bao sat down at the kitchen table, his head resting on his arms. Mai wanted to tell him to go lie down, but she knew he wouldn't. Not with the hunger gnawing at him. The small refrigerator hummed softly in the corner, as empty as it had been for days. She opened it anyway, as if somehow, by some miracle, there would be food. There wasn't. There was just the same bare emptiness, like an insult. She closed the door with a soft thud and turned to Bao. "Stay here," she said quietly, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Mom will figure something out." But even as she spoke the words, a knot twisted in her stomach. What was there to figure out? She had no more options left. She'd already asked for an advance at the store, but that had come and gone. She couldn't ask again. The last few bills in her purse wouldn't be enough to buy anything of substance. She could stretch them for a few days, but that was all. Soon, they would be without anything. And then, the doorbell rang, snapping her from her thoughts. She froze, not expecting anyone. The only people who visited her apartment were landlords demanding rent or government workers who occasionally stopped by for the neighborhood's community meetings. But this wasn't one of those times. When she opened the door, she found a stranger standing on the other side, his tall frame filling the doorway. He was neatly dressed in a sharp suit, his eyes dark but kind. He looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not standing in front of a crumbling apartment complex like the one she lived in. "Can I help you?" Mai asked, her voice wary. The man gave her a polite but somewhat distant smile. "Are you Mai?" he asked, his voice smooth and confident. She nodded, instinctively stepping back to block his view of the apartment. There was no reason to let a stranger in. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," he continued, glancing down at a small notebook in his hand. I'm Hugh. I believe you're the mother of Bao. Her heart skipped a beat. Bao? Why would this man know her son's name? She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Was something wrong? Had Bao gotten into trouble at school again? Yes, she said, her voice tightening with unease. I'm his mother. Is something wrong? Hugh's smile softened, as if sensing her unease. No, nothing like that. I'm just here to talk. It's about Bao. May I come in? Mai hesitated. There was something about him that made her uneasy. This wasn't the type of visitor she was used to, and her instincts screamed for her to shut the door. But before she could respond, Bao appeared from the kitchen, his small form standing behind her, rubbing his eyes as if he had just woken up. The man's gaze shifted from Mai to Bao, and there was something in his eyes, something almost too familiar, too knowing. For a split second he froze, his gaze locking onto Bao's. Bao, as always, didn't shy away. He tilted his head, eyes wide and curious. "Who are you?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Hugh," the man replied, his voice faltering just for a moment. I know you. I think we've met before." Mai's heart slammed in her chest. She glanced at Bao, whose innocent eyes blinked in confusion, unaware of the tension rising between them. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Mai said, her voice more firm now. "How do you know my son?" Hugh shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at Bao once more, as if deciding whether to continue. I'm afraid this may be difficult to explain," he began, his voice suddenly lower, almost hesitant. "But I think it's time you knew something." Mai felt a chill spread through her. The world outside her apartment, the cold rain and gray sky, seemed to press in on her, as if the air itself was growing heavier. Hugh stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the room with an unspoken tension. Bao stood still, staring up at him, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't understand," Mai repeated, her heart racing. "Who are you, really?" "I'm sorry for the confusion," Hugh said, his voice now more measured, more serious. "I'm actually here because I believe I'm Bao's father." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to comprehend. For a moment, Mai couldn't breathe. The room spun, the walls pressing in around her as if everything was collapsing in on itself. Bao's eyes flickered between the two of them, his confusion growing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Hugh turned his attention to Bao, his gaze softening. "I'm your father. I've been looking for you." Mai's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. This man, this stranger, was claiming to be Bao's father. How could that be? She had never once mentioned Bao's father to him. There had been no one. She had always taken the responsibility herself, with no one to share it with. The thought that anyone, let alone a man like this, could walk in and claim that role. Her vision blurred, and she stepped back, her hands shaking. "No. You're lying," she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Bao's father is gone. He's not here." Hugh's expression tightened. "I'm not lying, Mai. I didn't know about Bao either, not until recently. But I've been trying to find him." The words cut through her, each one like a knife to her chest. How could this be true? How could she have never known? Bao, sensing the tension, looked up at her. "Mom." His voice was small, vulnerable, as if he could sense the storm gathering inside her. Mai forced herself to look at Hugh again, her mind trying to make sense of the impossible. How do you know about him?" she whispered, barely able to speak. Hugh took a deep breath before answering, his voice calmer now, but no less intense. "I've been looking for you, Mai. I'm Bao's father. I'm Hugh." The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Each one landed harder than the last, a truth that she couldn't yet understand, but one that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about her son's past. Mai stood frozen in the middle of the small, dimly lit living room, her mind a storm of confusion and disbelief. The man who claimed to be Bao's father was still standing there, his presence commanding yet distant, like a specter from another life she never knew existed. She couldn't quite comprehend how this was happening, how a man who had no place in her life could suddenly appear and make such a claim, one that rattled everything she had ever believed about herself, about Bao and their struggle to survive. Bao, wide-eyed, stood beside her, sensing the sudden shift in the air. He didn't fully understand, but he could feel the unease, the tension that now hummed between them, thick and suffocating. He looked up at Hugh with a mixture of curiosity and confusion, his small hand slipping into his mother's, a silent plea for reassurance. "Mom," Bao whispered, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "What's happening?" Mai could barely bring herself to answer. Her heart was a cacophony of erratic beats, her chest tight with panic. She had always told Bao that it was just the two of them against the world. She had made him believe that they didn't need anyone else. But now this man, this stranger, had come into their lives, claiming to be the very thing she had never allowed herself to believe: a father. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat, the words scraping against her voice as she finally spoke. This man isn't your father, Bao. I don't know why he's saying this, but it's not true." But even as she spoke the words, something in the pit of her stomach told her that there was more to this than she could deny. She had lived too long under the crushing weight of uncertainty, never knowing where the next meal would come from, or whether Bao would be able to go to school the next day. She had built this life for them, brick by brick, and now, just as she thought they were starting to find some stability, this bombshell threatened to blow it all apart. Hugh, however, was unfazed by her words. His gaze softened as he looked at Bao, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand that this is difficult, Mai," he said, his tone steady, almost apologetic. "But I've spent years trying to find you. Trying to find Bao. And now that I've finally tracked you down, I need you to understand that I want to be part of his life. I'm not here to disrupt anything, but I have a right to be here, to be his father." The words stung, and Mai's chest tightened even further. How could he just waltz in like this and claim what he didn't deserve? She had fought tooth and nail for everything they had, and now this man, this stranger, expected to walk in and take everything she had worked for? "You don't know anything about us." Mai's voice cracked, her hands trembling as she stepped forward, trying to put some distance between herself and Hugh. "You don't know what it's been like for us. You don't know the nights I've spent crying, wondering if I'm doing enough. You don't know how many times I've gone to bed hungry just to make sure Bao had something to eat." Hugh's face softened, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes, one that mirrored her own in ways she hadn't expected. "I know, Mai," he said quietly. "I know more than you think. I've been trying to find you. I've been looking for years because I knew what kind of life Bao deserved. I may not have been there in the past, but I want to be there now." She recoiled, the words hitting her like a slap to the face. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to hear about his regrets, his years of absence. She had done this alone. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, those were her doing, not his. And now he wanted to walk in and take over like it was his right? She couldn't let that happen. But before she could speak again, Bao tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide and searching. "Mom," he said softly, "is he really my dad?" Mai's breath hitched in her throat. She had never seen Bao look at her with such vulnerability, such uncertainty. Her heart shattered at the sight of him standing there, caught in the middle of this mess, his innocent eyes looking to her for the answers she didn't have. She had always been the one to protect him, to shield him from the harshness of the world. But now, the world was threatening to pull him away from her, and she didn't know how to stop it. "Bao," she said, her voice trembling as she knelt in front of him, lifting his chin so their eyes could meet. "Listen to me. This man is not your father. He's a stranger and you don't need him. You have me. You've always had me." Bao didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at her, his small hand still gripping hers, his face a mask of confusion and hurt. And in that silence, something cracked inside Mai. She had spent so long convincing herself that everything she did was for Bao, that the sacrifices she made were enough to fill the emptiness left by his father's absence. But now, as she looked at him, she realized something that terrified her. Maybe it wasn't enough. Maybe it had never been enough. Hugh, sensing the tension, stepped forward again. "I know this is a lot to take in, Mai," he said, his voice softer now, more sincere. "But you're not alone in this anymore. I want to help. I can help. I can provide for him. I can give him the life he deserves." Mai stood up abruptly, her heart racing. "What life? The life you weren't there for? The life you abandoned?" Her words were harsh, filled with anger she didn't know she still carried. "No, Hugh. I'm doing fine without you. Bao is doing fine. You don't get to waltz back into our lives and act like everything's okay." Hugh's face tightened, the anger in his eyes now barely concealed. But instead of lashing out, he took a step back, his voice calm, though laced with something deeper. "I never said everything was okay, Mai. I'm not asking for things to go back to the way they were. I'm asking for a chance to be a part of his life. I'm asking for the chance to make things right." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but it was buried under years of pain and resentment. She didn't know how to accept it, how to let go of the walls she had spent so long building to protect herself and Bao from the world. She didn't know if she could ever trust him. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, until Bao broke it with a quiet, almost inaudible question. "Mom, could he help us?" Mai's heart sank. She had promised Bao she would always be enough. She had promised she would never let them go without. But in that moment she realized how much she had been fooling herself. They couldn't keep going like this, scraping by day after day. Something had to change. But could she let this man, this stranger, into their lives? Could she trust him? Or would his return only bring more hurt, more broken promises? Her gaze flicked to Hugh, his steady eyes waiting for her response, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't know what the right choice was. The days following Hugh's unexpected arrival felt like they were stretching into an eternity, each hour dragging slower than the last. Mai tried to convince herself that it was just a fleeting moment of confusion, a misunderstanding that would eventually dissipate, but the weight of his presence in their lives was undeniable. Every time she looked at Bao, the uncertainty in his eyes reminded her of just how much was at stake. She had always kept him in a world where she was his only protector, but now there was an intruder, someone who claimed to be the one who should have been there all along. She hadn't seen Hugh since the day he came to their apartment, and part of her was relieved by that. But the other part of her, the part that feared the inevitable, knew that the world was closing in around her. Bao was too young to understand the intricacies of what was happening, but Mai could see the confusion growing in his small, quiet moments, the way he would look at Hugh's business card that she had absent-mindedly left on the kitchen counter, or the way he asked her why he didn't look like his father. One evening, when the light from the setting sun was starting to spill into the apartment, Mai sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the bills scattered before her. She had been trying to balance what little money she had left, but every figure seemed to mock her. There was nothing left to stretch. She could barely afford to keep the lights on, let alone buy the food they needed. Bao, having just returned from school, entered the kitchen quietly. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching her, waiting. She looked up from the bills, her tired eyes meeting his. She knew that he could sense the mounting pressure, the strain she was doing everything to hide. "Mom," Bao said after a moment, his voice tentative, almost afraid. "Can we see him? The man who said he's my dad." Mai's heart stopped. She couldn't keep lying to him. But could she tell him the truth? Could she admit that she didn't know what the hell was happening anymore? That everything was slipping out of her control? She sighed, pushing her hands through her hair, then stood up, taking Bao's hand in hers. She didn't have an answer, but what she did know was that the longer she put this off, the harder it would be to make a decision. "We're going to see him," Mai said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside. But we need to talk first. The ride to Hugh's office was longer than it had any right to be. Mai kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her thoughts a maelstrom. Bao was beside her in the back seat, his silence unnerving, as though he could sense that things were about to change. When they arrived at the sleek, modern building that housed Hugh's company, Mai's stomach churned. It felt like a world apart from everything she knew, a world of glass walls and polished floors. This was where he belonged. Not in the cramped apartment, not in the struggle for survival that she had carved out, piece by piece. This was where people like him existed, people with power, money, and connections. She didn't belong here. And neither, she thought with a sudden pang, did Bao. Hugh was waiting for them in the lobby, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his posture relaxed but confident. As soon as he saw them, he stood up, a warm smile spreading across his face, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he greeted them, too rehearsed, too controlled. "My Bao," Hugh said, his voice smooth, welcoming. "I'm glad you could make it." Mai nodded stiffly, but didn't speak. Bao, standing behind her, still hadn't fully grasped the weight of the situation. He glanced at Hugh, then at Mai, his small hands tugging nervously at the hem of his shirt. Hugh's eyes softened as he looked at Bao. "How was school today, son?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange mixture of affection and ownership. It felt wrong, somehow. Too familiar, too soon. Bao glanced at his mother, uncertain, before answering in a small voice. "It was okay." "I'm sure you're tired," Hugh said, his smile widening. "Come, let's sit down. We can talk. I want you to feel at home." Mai hesitated but followed him to a nearby table in the corner of the sleek, minimalist office. Hugh's assistant brought them drinks, water, nothing fancy, and Mai sat stiffly across from him, Bao seated beside her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the way he was studying them, evaluating them like they were subjects of a grand experiment. "So," Hugh began after a few moments, the silence stretching out between them, "I've been thinking about how best to move forward. You've both been through so much already, and I don't want to make this transition difficult for you. I'm willing to help in any way I can." Mai could feel the anger rising in her chest again. Help? Was that what this was? A pity? A charity? "You don't get to just walk into our lives and start offering help," Mai said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "You weren't there for Bao. You weren't there when I needed someone, when we needed someone. And now you think you can just show up and make everything better." Hugh's calm expression didn't waver. "I'm not here to make everything better, Mai. I'm here because Bao deserves more than this." His eyes flicked toward the small apartment that had been their sanctuary and their prison all at once. "And I can give him that." "I don't need your money," Mai snapped, leaning forward. "I don't need anything from you." But before she could say more, Hugh reached into his suit jacket and pulled out an envelope, setting it down in front of her. It was thick, too thick for a normal letter. Mai frowned, unsure of what he was doing. "I know you're struggling, Mai," Hugh said, his tone softening just a fraction. "This is for you. To make things easier. I don't expect you to accept it right away, but please, think about it." Mai stared at the envelope. She could feel her heart racing, her hands starting to shake. She had no idea what was inside, but her gut told her that it was something that could change everything. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. The moment her eyes landed on the check inside, the breath caught in her throat. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her life, more money than she could ever imagine earning. It was a lifeline, a way out, an escape from the suffocating grip of poverty that had held her in place for so long. But then, a thought flashed through her mind. It wasn't the money she needed. It was something deeper, something she couldn't buy. She had fought for so long to protect Bao, to shield him from the harsh reality of the world. But was she protecting him from a future, or from the man who could offer him a better one? "Why?" she whispered, staring at the check, her voice barely audible. Hugh's gaze softened, almost as if he knew what she was thinking. Because, I can't undo the past. But I can help you build a future. For Bao. For both of you. The words settled heavily between them, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about Hugh. It was about Bao, about the choices that lay before him, and the kind of future he would have. The question wasn't whether or not to trust Hugh, but whether she could let go of her pride long enough to give Bao a chance at something better. The days after the meeting at Hugh's office felt like a blur, a haze of conflicting emotions that I couldn't quite shake off. Every moment with Bao now seemed heavier, as if the very air they breathed carried the weight of decisions not yet made. The check Hugh had left on the table had never been touched. It remained an unspoken presence, a reminder of the life that could have been, or the life that could still be, if only she knew how to choose. Mai found herself staring at it often, tracing the edges with her fingers as if by doing so, she could somehow unravel the mystery of it all. The money was a temptation, an easy answer to all the sleepless nights spent wondering how to feed Bao, how to pay the rent. But something about it gnawed at her, something deeper than the surface-level allure of comfort. Bao had noticed her growing silence, the way she seemed lost in thought more often than not. He hadn't asked about the check. He hadn't asked about Hugh. He was a child, after all, and what he wanted most in the world was his mother's attention, her warmth. But he couldn't help but sense the distance that was creeping between them. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, another simple meal that had taken all of Mai's energy to prepare, Bao looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mom," he said, his voice tentative but clear, "are we going to see him again? The man. Hugh." Mai's heart twisted in her chest. She hadn't realized how much of an impact that meeting had made on him. For days, she had been consumed by her own inner turmoil, but Bao had been carrying the question in his heart, waiting for an answer he didn't know how to ask. "I don't know, Bao," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. She wiped her hands on the napkin in her lap, avoiding his gaze for a moment. "It's complicated. Is he going to be my dad now?" Bao asked, his words small but laced with hope. The question stung more than she expected. It was simple, innocent, yet it pierced through all the layers of uncertainty and fear that had built up inside her. What was she supposed to say to him? That everything would stay the same? That nothing would change? Or that the man who had abandoned them for so long now wanted to be a part of their lives? Mai took a deep breath, looking down at her plate before meeting his gaze. "Bao, listen to me. I'm your mother. No matter what happens, that will never change. I'll always be here for you, okay? But sometimes life changes. People change. And we have to decide what's best for us." Bao nodded, though his eyes were still filled with questions. "So, it's okay if I want to see him? If I want to know him?" Her heart twisted. "I'll never stop you from wanting to know about your father. But, Bao, there's something you need to understand. We don't need anyone else to make us whole. You and we've always had each other, and that's enough. That always has been." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. She was trying to reassure him, trying to make him believe in the strength of their bond, but she could feel the cracks in her own resolve. Was it enough? Could it really be enough? The days turned into weeks, and as the pressure of the decision weighed on her, Mai found herself increasingly distant, retreating into herself. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together, but now she was breaking piece by piece. Hugh's offer, the promise of a better life for Bao, tugged at her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the money, though that was undeniably a temptation. It was the idea of Bao having something she could never give him, a father, someone to guide him, to offer him stability. She had worked so hard to provide for him, but was it enough? But then, one night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized something. She was so focused on what she couldn't offer Bao, that she was forgetting what she had already given him, everything. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of her life had been dedicated to him. She had built their world from the ground up, and she had done it with love, with resilience. And that was something no amount of money or promises from a stranger could ever replace. I woke early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, and sat at the kitchen table. The check was still there, untouched, a silent testament to all the things she could never accept. The weight of it had been heavy, but now it seemed lighter. She wasn't rejecting it because of pride or stubbornness. She was rejecting it because she didn't need it. Bao didn't need it. As the sun began to rise, casting its soft golden light across the room, I felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. She wasn't alone. She had Bao, and that was enough. They were enough. And the truth was, she had always known that. She had just needed to remind herself. She stood, walked over to the table, and slowly folded the check into a drawer, out of sight, out of mind. She wasn't giving up on Bao having a relationship with his father, but she was finally letting go of the fear that she wasn't enough. She had been enough all along. Later that morning, Bao came to her with a piece of paper in hand, a wide grin on his face. "Look, Mom. I drew a picture of me and you." I smiled as she looked at the crayon drawing, an image of her and Bao, holding hands, standing side by side. The simplicity of it, the purity, was overwhelming. Bao didn't need anything else. He didn't need the money, the promises, or the past. All he needed was her. I hugged him tightly, pressing her face against his messy hair. "I love you, Bao. Always remember that. I'll always be here, no matter what happens." Bao's arms wrapped around her neck, his small voice full of trust and love. "I know, Mom. I know." The future was uncertain, but in that moment, I realized that it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was more than enough. No matter what came next, they would face it together, with strength, with love, and with the unshakable bond they had built over the years. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, I knew that this was the beginning of something new. Not just for Bao, but for herself as well. It wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning.